The strong scent of polish and leather filled the air as the elite of the canine world took their seats in the grand auction house. This wasn't just any dog auction. It was an exclusive event for the wealthy, the renowned breeders, and powerful investors who shaped the industry. The murmur of conversations, the clinking of whiskey glasses, and the occasional rustling of auction catalogs created an atmosphere of exclusivity. But the moment Silas Beckett walked through the doors, an uncomfortable pause swept across the room. He did not belong there, at least that's what they all thought. His worn-out flannel shirt, dust-covered boots, and weathered jeans stood in stark contrast to the tailored suits and polished shoes around him. His salt-and-pepper beard was unkempt, and his calloused hands told a lifetime of labor, not luxury. Yet, despite the judgmental glances thrown his way, he walked with purpose, not hesitation. A young man in an expensive blazer leaned toward his companion, sneering. "Who let that old man in here? He looks like he couldn't afford a leash, let alone a purebred." Silas paid them no mind. His steel-gray eyes were locked onto the holding area where a magnificent German shepherd sat in dignified silence. The dog's raw power and intelligent eyes were unmistakable, but Silas saw more than just a prized animal. He saw a connection, a past, a truth that no one else in that room could comprehend. As he stepped closer, a tall, broad-shouldered security guard in a crisp Navy uniform blocked his path. "Sir, this auction is for serious buyers only. If you're not here to do business, I'll have to ask you to leave." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to watch. Silas lifted his head slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion. But the look in his eyes, a mixture of determination and something deeper, something that spoke of loss and reverence, caused the security guard to hesitate for just a moment. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Silas Beckett hadn't always been the weathered man who entered the auction house that day. Once his name had commanded respect in military and law enforcement circles across the country. A third-generation dog trainer whose German shepherds had served in Vietnam, police departments, and elite military units, Silas had built his reputation through decades of careful breeding and impeccable training methods. His ranch outside of Missoula, Montana, had once been the premier training ground for service dogs. The Beckett bloodline, as it came to be known, produced German shepherds with exceptional intelligence, loyalty, and working ability. These weren't show dogs with exaggerated features. They were functional, powerful animals with sound temperaments and extraordinary capabilities. Presidents had owned his dogs. Special forces teams had deployed with them. Police departments had waiting lists years long. But that had been before the tragedy, before his only son, Duke, had followed in his footsteps, joining the military as a dog handler, before both Duke and his assigned shepherd, bred by Silas himself, had been killed in an ambush during a rescue operation in a distant desert. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday morning, turning Silas's world to ash. In the fog of grief that followed, Silas had become vulnerable. Preston Holloway, a businessman with connections but no real understanding of dogs, had seized the opportunity. Through a combination of questionable legal maneuvers, forged signatures, and exploiting Silas's distracted state, Preston had managed to acquire rights to the Beckett bloodline and the business that had taken 3 generations to build. By the time Silas emerged from his grief enough to fight back, it was too late. The courts sided with the paperwork, not the broken man who couldn't afford proper legal representation. Preston took everything: the facilities, the breeding stock, the name, and most importantly, the legacy. Now, at 73, Silas lived in a small cabin on what remained of his land. He trained the occasional dog for locals who remembered his name, but mostly kept to himself. His hands, once steady enough to perform minor veterinary procedures, now showed a slight tremor. His back, once straight as a ramrod when demonstrating proper handling, now bent slightly from years of physical labor. But his eyes, those steel-gray eyes, still burned with the same intensity they always had. And when he heard about the auction, about the last descendant of his original bloodline being sold. Those eyes had found a new purpose. The envelope had arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered by Frank Wilson, Silas's old military buddy who now worked as a mail carrier. Frank hadn't just dropped it in the rusty mailbox at the end of the drive. He'd brought it all the way to the porch, concern etched on his face. "You might want to take a look at this, Silas," Frank had said, handing over the glossy invitation. "Came all the way from that fancy auction house in Billings." Sitting in his rocking chair, Silas had torn open the envelope with calloused fingers. The invitation was embossed with gold lettering, announcing the exclusive purebred canine auction hosted by Holloway Kennels. His eyes had scanned the details until they locked on a single photograph, a German shepherd with the unmistakable features of his bloodline. The listing described the dog as the last descendant of the legendary Beckett line, perfect for breeding or service work. "Son of a bitch," Silas had muttered, his hand tightening on the paper. "That's Duke's dog's grandson." Frank had leaned against the porch railing, shaking his head. "You thinking about going?" Silas had said nothing, but the fire in his eyes had answered for him. Now, standing in the elegant auction house, Silas felt every bit the outsider. The glossy wooden floors, the crystal chandeliers, the men and women in clothing that cost more than his monthly pension. It was a world away from his cabin with its worn furniture and faded photographs. But he hadn't come for the luxury. He'd come for something far more valuable. As he made his way through the crowd, the whispers followed him like shadows. "Is that a homeless man? Security should really screen at the door. Does he smell like dog, or is that just me?" A woman in a pearl necklace physically stepped aside as he passed, as though poverty might be contagious. Silas ignored them all, his focus remaining on the German shepherd in the holding area. Even from this distance he could see the dog was underweight and stressed, its coat lacking the lustrous shine it should have had. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. The security guard who blocked his path was young, probably no older than Duke had been when he died. His nameplate read Thompson, and his expression was torn between duty and discomfort. "Sir, I need to see your invitation," Thompson said, his voice firm but not unkind. Silas reached into his worn jacket and produced the invitation. "Got it right here, son." The guard looked surprised but nodded and began to step aside. That's when a booming voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Hold on there, Marcus." A tall man in an expensive suit approached, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his smile cold as January in Montana. "Preston Holloway. I don't believe this. Gentlemen, is on our approved bidder list." Preston's eyes traveled from Silas's scuffed boots to his weathered face with theatrical distaste. "Silas Beckett. I must admit, I'm surprised you'd show your face here. Glutton for punishment?" The room had gone quiet, all eyes on the confrontation. Silas didn't blink, didn't flinch. "I received an invitation, Preston, just like everybody else." Preston's laugh was sharp, designed to cut. "That was a courtesy, old man. We send them to all former breeders, even failures." He gestured broadly to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, for those unfamiliar, this is Silas Beckett. Once upon a time, he had a reputation in German shepherds. Now, he's just another cautionary tale about poor business decisions." The crowd tittered with laughter. A woman whispered loudly, "He looks more like the dogs than the owners." Preston moved closer, his voice dropping so only Silas and those nearby could hear. "You can't afford anything in this room, Beckett. Why don't you save yourself the embarrassment and head back to whatever hole you crawled out of?" Silas met Preston's gaze without wavering. "I didn't come here to reminisce, Holloway. I came to bid." Preston's eyebrows shot up, and then he burst into theatrical laughter. "You? Bid?" He turned to the crowd. "Seems our unexpected guest thinks he's still in the game. Tell me, Silas, are you planning to pay with Social Security checks or empty promises?" More laughter rippled through the room. But Silas remained unmoved, his eyes drifting to the German shepherd. The dog had risen, its ears pricked forward, its gaze fixed on Silas with an intensity that silenced Preston for a moment. "That dog doesn't belong in a place like this," Silas said quietly, "and neither do you." The amusement drained from Preston's face, replaced by something harder. "Security," he snapped. "Escort Mr. Beckett out. He's disturbing our guests." As Marcus Thompson reluctantly moved to comply, Silas Beckett stood his ground, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "I have an invitation and the means to bid." "Unless you're breaking your own rules, Preston, I'm staying right here." The tension that followed Silas's declaration hung in the air like a thundercloud. Preston's face had flushed a deep crimson, his carefully cultivated image of control slipping. For a moment, it seemed he might order security to remove Silas anyway, rules be damned. But then Eleanor Whitfield, the auction house manager, stepped forward with practiced grace. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to command attention, "all registered guests with valid invitations are permitted to bid." Her smile was professionally neutral as she turned to Silas. "However, Mr. Beckett, I must remind you that all winning bids require immediate financial verification." Preston's smile returned, tight and predatory. "Of course, Eleanor. Let him stay. It's always good to have entertainment." The crowd's laughter followed Silas as he made his way to an empty seat in the back row. He sat stiffly, aware of the stares and whispers, but focused solely on the matter at hand. Through the next 30 minutes, purebred retrievers, bulldogs, and terriers came and went, fetching prices that would have bought a decent car or even put a down payment on a house. Silas remained silent, waiting. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat with a flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen, lot number 17, the pride of our auction today, Duke's Legacy, a purebred German shepherd from the original Beckett bloodline." A handler led the German shepherd onto the small stage. Despite the dog's obvious poor condition, ribs slightly visible, coat dull, a wariness in its eyes, the animal moved with natural grace and power. Silas's chest tightened. This wasn't just any dog from his old line. The markings, the stance, the intelligent eyes. This was the spitting image of his son's dog, the one that had died trying to protect Duke in that distant desert. "This exceptional animal comes from the most prestigious German shepherd lineage in American history," the auctioneer continued. "The Beckett line provided dogs for presidents and generals. This may be the last purebred descendant available for private ownership. We'll start the bidding at $20,000. A hand shot up immediately. "20,000. "25, called another voice. The numbers climbed rapidly. $30, $40, $50,000. With each bid, Preston Holloway's smile grew wider. He hadn't placed a bid himself. He didn't need to. He already owned the dog technically. This was merely converting it to cash. And the bidding was exceeding expectations. "60,000, called a woman in the front row whom Silas recognized as Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a well-known veterinarian who specialized in working dogs. "65, countered a man in a hunting jacket. Throughout it all, Silas remained motionless, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving the German shepherd. The dog had been scanning the crowd, but when its gaze fell on Silas, something changed. Its ears pricked forward, its posture shifted subtly. Recognition? Impossible, yet something had registered. "Do I hear 70,000? The auctioneer called, his voice rising with excitement. 70, came a new bid. 75, $80,000, Dr. Reynolds called out, her face determined. The auctioneer beamed. 80,000 from Dr. Reynolds. Do I hear 85? Preston was practically glowing with satisfaction, his eyes occasionally darting to Silas with undisguised mockery. He leaned over to Jonathan Mercer, his business partner, and whispered something that made both men chuckle while glancing at Silas. 80,000 going once, the auctioneer called, his gavel raised. The German shepherd had not taken its eyes off Silas. There was an intensity in the animal's gaze that seemed to reach across the room. 80,000 going twice. $200,000. The voice that cut through the auction house was steady, deep, and unmistakably Silas's. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a silence so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Every head turned toward the back row where Silas Beckett sat, his expression unchanged, his eyes still fixed on the dog. The auctioneer stood frozen, his gavel suspended in mid-air. Did you say 200,000, Mr. Beckett? That's what I said, Silas confirmed, his voice carrying easily in the stunned silence. Preston Holloway's face had drained of all color. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "He can't possibly have that kind of money." Eleanor Whitfield stepped forward again, her composure slightly rattled. "Mr. Beckett, I must remind you that all winning bids require immediate verification of funds. We cannot accept installment plans or—" "Cash," Silas interrupted. "I'll pay in cash, right here, right now." Another wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Dr. Reynolds was staring at Silas with newfound respect, while most others wore expressions ranging from disbelief to amusement. They were waiting for the punchline, for the moment this farce would be exposed. Preston pushed past Eleanor, marching down the aisle toward Silas. "This is a stunt," he announced loudly. "This man is trying to disrupt a legitimate auction. He's been bitter for years because he couldn't handle his business properly, and now he's trying to sabotage mine." Silas finally turned his gaze from the dog to Preston. "No stunt, Holloway. $200,000 for the dog, cash, unless you got a higher bidder." "He doesn't have it," Preston insisted to the crowd. "This is harassment, plain and simple." Eleanor raised her voice. "Mr. Holloway, please return to your seat. Mr. Beckett, if you are the highest bidder when the gavel falls, you will need to produce verification immediately." Silas nodded once. "Understood." The auctioneer, recovering his professional demeanor, cleared his throat. "We have a bid of $200,000 from Mr. Beckett. Do I hear 205? The room remained silent. Dr. Reynolds shook her head slightly when the auctioneer looked her way. The man in the hunting jacket was studiously examining his catalog. No one was willing to follow Silas to this height, either out of certainty he would be humiliated, or perhaps for some out of a growing sense that something more significant was happening than a simple auction. 200,000 going once, the auctioneer called. The German shepherd stood at alert now, its entire body oriented toward Silas. Going twice. Preston's face contorted with fury and disbelief. Sold to Mr. Silas Beckett for $200,000. The crack of the gavel echoed through the auction house like a gunshot. The auction house remained frozen in stunned silence following the fall of the gavel. Eleanor Whitfield was the first to recover, professional responsibility outweighing her surprise. She stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Beckett, if you'll follow me to the verification office, we can complete the transaction." Silas rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate. Years of physical labor had left their mark on his body. A slight stiffness in his right knee from an old military injury, a careful way of straightening his back, but he carried himself with quiet dignity as he followed Eleanor. As he passed the front row, Dr. Catherine Reynolds gave him a small nod of acknowledgment. Their eyes met briefly, something unspoken passing between them. Preston Holloway's face had transformed into a mask of barely contained rage. He grabbed his business partner Jonathan Mercer's arm. "This is impossible," he hissed. "How could that old fool possibly have $200,000 in cash? He lives in a run-down cabin." Mercer shrugged, his expression calculating. Maybe he's been saving his whole life for this. No one saves that kind of money, Preston snapped. Something's not right. As Silas passed him, Preston stepped directly into his path, forcing him to stop. "What's your game, Beckett?" he demanded loud enough for nearby attendees to hear. "You don't have this kind of money. Everyone here knows you lost everything years ago." Silas met Preston's glare with calm steadiness. "Move aside, Preston. Not until you explain yourself. This is harassment, and I won't stand for it." Eleanor stepped between them, her voice firm. "Mr. Holloway, please. This is a reputable establishment. If Mr. Beckett cannot verify his funds, the dog will go to the next highest bidder. There's a process." Preston's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, allowing Silas and Eleanor to continue toward the office at the rear of the auction hall. The murmurs resumed immediately, the room alive with speculation and gossip. Inside the small verification office, Eleanor closed the door and turned to Silas. Her professional veneer slipped slightly, revealing genuine curiosity. "Mr. Beckett, I'm required to verify your ability to complete this purchase before finalizing the sale?" Silas nodded, reaching into his worn jacket. He removed an envelope, the paper creased and soft from being carried close to his body. Without a word, he handed it to Eleanor. She opened it, her eyes widening as she examined the cashier's check inside. "This is in order," she said carefully, looking up at him with new respect. $200,000, as bid." "The dog is mine, then," Silas said. "It wasn't a question." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll have Marcus bring him in." While they waited, Eleanor studied Silas with unconcealed curiosity. "Mr. Beckett, if you don't mind my asking, this dog seems particularly important to you." Silas was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "That dog is the last of my bloodline," he finally said. "The last connection to something I built over a lifetime. Something that was taken from me." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened, and Marcus Thompson entered, leading the German Shepherd. The dog's demeanor had changed entirely. Where before it had been alert but cautious, now it strained at the leash, its attention fixed entirely on Silas. "He's been acting strange since the bidding ended," Marcus commented. "Never seen him like this." Silas knelt slowly, his old joints protesting. He held out one weathered hand, palm up. "Come here, boy," he said softly. The German Shepherd lurched forward so eagerly that Marcus nearly lost his grip on the leash. Eleanor stepped back in surprise as the dog reached Silas and froze, its nose working overtime, taking in his scent. For 3 heartbeats, dog and man stared at each other. Then the shepherd made a sound somewhere between a whine and a sigh, pressing his head into Silas's palm. "Recognizes you?" Eleanor said in astonishment. "Not me," Silas corrected, his voice rough with emotion, the scent of his ancestors. "Dogs remember what people forget." The door burst open, shattering the moment. Preston Holloway stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. Behind him, several auction attendees had gathered, drawn by the commotion. "I demand to see proof of payment," Preston announced. "This whole situation stinks of fraud." Eleanor stepped forward, professional once more. "Mr. Holloway, I verified Mr. Beckett's payment. The transaction is legitimate and complete." "Impossible," Preston snarled. "He's a washed-up nobody living on a scrap of land and Social Security. Where would he get this kind of money?" Silas had risen to his feet, one hand resting on the German Shepherd's head, the dog pressed against his leg, a low growl building in its throat as it watched Preston. "Not everyone flashes their wealth like a peacock, Holloway," Silas said quietly. "Some of us have other priorities." Something in Silas's calm certainty seemed to infuriate Preston further. "This is some kind of scheme. You're trying to sabotage me, aren't you? Found some wealthy backer who has it out for me?" The accusation hung in the air. Several of the onlookers exchanged glances. the atmosphere growing increasingly uncomfortable. "The only scheme here was selling a malnourished dog for profit," Silas replied, his voice hardening as he gestured to the German shepherd's visible ribs. "This animal hasn't been properly cared for in months." Preston's face darkened further. "How dare you? That dog has received the best care money can buy." Dr. Catherine Reynolds pushed her way through the gathered crowd. "I'm afraid Mr. Beckett is right," she said, her professional authority evident in her tone. "I noticed it during the auction. This dog is at least 15 pounds underweight, and that coat conditions suggest nutritional deficiencies." Preston turned on her. "Keep your opinions to yourself, Reynolds. Not everyone subscribes to your bleeding heart approach to dog breeding." "It's not opinion, it's veterinary medicine," Dr. Reynolds replied coolly, "and I'd be happy to document my assessment for the American Kennel Club's Ethics Committee." The threat wasn't subtle. Several of Preston's associates shifted uncomfortably, distancing themselves slightly from the escalating confrontation. Eleanor Whitfield cleared her throat. "This has gone far enough. The auction is complete, the sale verified. Mr. Beckett now owns the dog legally. If there are concerns about the animal's prior care, that's a separate matter." Preston's eyes narrowed as he looked from Eleanor to Silas to the German shepherd. Then, unexpectedly, his anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a cold smile. "Fine," he said, straightening his tie. "Take the dog, Beckett. A remarkable coincidence, isn't it? You showing up here today, cash in hand, for this specific animal." Something in his tone raised alarms in Silas's mind. The shift was too abrupt, too calculated. "No coincidence," Silas replied evenly. "I received an invitation, same as everyone." Preston's smile widened, taking on a predatory quality. "But your invitation was special, wasn't it? Sent directly to your little cabin with this specific dog prominently featured." The room had gone quiet again, all eyes moving between the two men. "What are you getting at, Holloway?" Silas asked, his hand tightening slightly on the German shepherd's fur. Preston turned to address the room at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to enlighten you. Mr. Beckett didn't just happen to attend our auction today. He was specifically invited by me." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Eleanor stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, this is highly irregular. If you have concerns about the auction process—" Preston waved her off. "No concerns about your process, Eleanor. Just sharing some context with our guests." He turned back to the crowd. "You see, I knew exactly who this dog's ancestors were. I knew exactly what it would mean to old Silas here, and I knew he'd empty his savings to get it back." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of uncomfortable realization through the onlookers. This hadn't been just an auction. It had been personal. "You sent that invitation to hurt him," Dr. Reynolds said, the accusation clear in her voice. Preston shrugged, unapologetic. "Business is business. If the old man wants to pay 4 times market value for a dog, who am I to complain? Call it a reckoning for past grievances." Silas stood motionless, only the tightening of his jaw betraying his emotions. The German shepherd sensed the tension, pressing closer to his leg. "There's one thing you miscalculated, Preston," Silas finally said. "You thought this would break me. It hasn't." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Preston's face. $200,000 for a dog? That's your entire life savings, Beckett. You've got nothing left. "I've got what matters," Silas replied, looking down at the German shepherd, "and you've just shown everyone in this room exactly who you are." Indeed, the mood in the room had shifted perceptibly. Where before there had been mockery of Silas, now there were uncomfortable glances directed at Preston. His attempted power play had revealed a vindictiveness that many found distasteful. Jonathan Mercer stepped forward, placing a warning hand on Preston's arm. "Perhaps we should conclude the auction, Preston. We still have other lots to present." Preston shook him off. "No, I want everyone to understand what's happening here. This man," he jabbed a finger toward Silas, lost his business because he couldn't adapt to modern methods, because he was stuck in the past while I was looking to the future. He's been bitter ever since, and now he's spending his last dollar on some misguided revenge." "Modern methods?" Dr. Reynolds interjected. "Is that what you call cutting corners on care and nutrition? Breeding dogs until their bodies break down? Those aren't modern methods, Preston. They're exploitation." Several heads nodded in agreement. Preston's face flushed again as he realized the narrative was slipping from his control. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I've revolutionized the breeding industry, increased efficiency, maximized profit margins." "Profit margins?" an older gentleman in the back called out. "We're talking about living animals, Holloway, not widgets on an assembly line." The room was now clearly divided, those who viewed dogs purely as commodities standing with Preston, those who recognized them as living beings shifting toward Silas and Dr. Reynolds. In the midst of this growing discord, Silas remained calm, one hand still resting on the German shepherd's head. The dog hadn't taken its eyes off Preston, as if measuring the threat he posed. "You've made your point, Holloway," Silas said. "You invited me here to humiliate me, to drain my savings to get one last victory. Congratulations, you've got your money. I've got my dog. We're done here." He turned to Eleanor. "Ma'am, if there's paperwork to complete, I'd like to do it now. This animal needs proper food and care." Eleanor nodded, visibly relieved at the potential de-escalation. "Of course, Mr. Beckett, if you will follow me—" "We're not done," Preston interrupted, stepping closer to Silas. "Not by a long shot. You think this is over? That dog is just one animal. I own the rights to your entire bloodline, every technique you developed, every connection you built. I own your legacy, Beckett." Something dangerous flashed in Silas's eyes. "You own papers and contracts, Preston, not legacy, not knowledge, and certainly not respect." Preston laughed, though it sounded forced. "Respect doesn't pay the bills, old man. Money does. And while you're scraping by in that run-down cabin with your one dog, I'll be making millions from the bloodline you started." Silas regarded him steadily. "Is that really how you measure success? By the dollars in your bank account?" "In this world, absolutely," Preston replied. "What else matters? Honor, integrity, the welfare of the animals in your care." Silas gestured to the German shepherd. "This dog is underweight, stressed, and neglected, and you put him up for auction anyway. What does that say about your operation?" The accusation struck a nerve. Preston took another step forward, entering Silas's personal space. "You self-righteous old fool! You think anyone cares about your outdated notions of honor? This is business. The only thing that matters is results." The tension between them had become palpable. The German shepherd's growl deepened, sensing the hostility directed at Silas. "Back off, Holloway," Silas warned quietly. "The dog doesn't like your tone." Preston glanced down at the shepherd, contempt clear in his expression. "Please, that animal is trained not to act without command." Another Beckett specialty. "Dogs that think for themselves but obey absolutely. Isn't that right?" As if to prove his point, Preston raised his hand suddenly. Whether he intended to gesture emphatically or to fake a strike at Silas wasn't clear, but the German shepherd reacted instantly. It lunged forward with a warning bark, placing itself between Preston and Silas. Preston stumbled backwards, genuine fear flashing across his face. "Control your animal," he demanded. Silas laid a gentle hand on the dog's back. "Easy, boy," he murmured. The German shepherd settled immediately, though it remained alert, watching Preston. "You see," Silas said quietly, "he does think for himself, and he's made a judgment about you." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Preston straightened his jacket, trying to regain his composure. "This is exactly why your methods were obsolete, Beckett. Unpredictable dogs are dangerous dogs." There's nothing unpredictable about it, Dr. Reynolds interjected. That dog just demonstrated perfect discernment. It recognized a threat and positioned itself protectively without excessive aggression. Preston glared at her. Whose side are you on, Reynolds? The animals, she replied simply. Always have been. Eleanor Whitfield stepped between them, her patience clearly wearing thin. Gentlemen, this auction house is not the appropriate venue for personal grievances. Mr. Beckett has purchased the dog legally. The matter is concluded. Preston looked as though he might argue further, but Jonathan Mercer spoke up from behind him. She's right, Preston. We've made the sale. Let's move on. For a long moment, Preston stood rigid with fury. Then abruptly he smiled, a cold, calculating expression that didn't reach his eyes. Fine, he said. Take your dog, Beckett. Enjoy your little victory. But remember, you've just spent everything you have, and I'm still holding all the cards. With that, he turned and strode away, signaling for the auction to continue. The crowd began to disperse, returning to their seats, though many cast curious glances back at Silas and the German shepherd. Dr. Reynolds approached, her expression concerned. That dog needs a proper examination and a nutrition plan, she said quietly. And I suspect he's never had proper socialization. Preston's facilities are essentially puppy mills with a fancy veneer. Silas nodded. I can see that. Would you be willing to give him a checkup? My regular vet's retired. Of course, she replied, offering him a business card. And Mr. Beckett, what Preston did, setting you up like this, it was cruel. Silas pocketed the card. Cruelty requires power, Dr. Reynolds, and Preston just discovered he has less of that than he thought. As they completed the paperwork, the German shepherd never left Silas's side. Several times the dog pressed against his leg or looked up at his face, as if reassuring itself that Silas was real. For his part, Silas maintained contact, a hand on the dog's head, fingers gently stroking an ear, small gestures of connection that seemed to calm them both. When the final document was signed, Elena handed Silas a leather leash and the dog's registration papers. He's officially yours now, Mr. Beckett, though I get the feeling he already knew that. Silas accepted the documents and clipped the leash to the German shepherd's collar. Thank you, Miss Whitfield. You've conducted yourself with integrity throughout this situation. She smiled slightly. Not my first difficult auction, though certainly one of the more memorable ones. As Silas turned to leave, he found Marcus Thompson, the security guard, waiting by the door. The young man's expression had transformed from earlier suspicion to something approaching respect. Sir, Marcus said, I want to apologize for earlier. I was just doing my job, but still. Silas nodded. No apology needed, son. You were professional throughout. Marcus glanced down at the German shepherd. He's really something. You can tell there's intelligence behind those eyes. That's the Beckett line, Silas replied, a hint of pride in his voice. Smart enough to think, disciplined enough to listen. As Silas and the German shepherd walked toward the exit, he could feel Preston Holloway's eyes burning into his back from the auction podium. The battle lines had been drawn today. This confrontation, Silas knew, was far from over. But for now, with the last descendant of his beloved bloodline walking beside him, Silas Beckett had won the first round. The Montana evening air greeted Silas and the German shepherd with a sharp, cleansing chill as they exited the auction house. The sky had begun its transition from azure to deep indigo, the first stars appearing like distant sentinels. For a moment, Silas simply stood on the steps, allowing the dog to adjust to the new surroundings, watching as the animal's nose worked overtime, cataloging the scents of the unfamiliar environment. First step toward home, boy, Silas murmured, more to himself than to the dog. He had begun to lead the German shepherd toward his truck when a voice called out behind him. Mr. Beckett, a moment, please. Silas turned to find Dr. Catherine Reynolds hurrying down the auction house steps toward him, her medical bag clutched in one hand. "You are leaving already?" she asked as she reached him. "I thought you might want me to take a quick look at him first." Silas hesitated. The German Shepherd was pressing against his leg, a subtle but unmistakable indication of stress. After the chaos inside, what the dog needed most was calm and quiet. "Appreciate the offer, Doctor, but I think he needs some peace right now. Tomorrow would be better, if you're available." Dr. Reynolds nodded, her clinical gaze assessing the dog. "You're right, of course. Minimizing stress should be the priority." She pulled out a business card. "My clinic opens at 8. Come by any time and I'll fit you in." As Silas accepted the card, the auction house doors burst open again. Preston Holloway emerged, flanked by Jonathan Mercer and two men Silas didn't recognize, large athletic types with the unmistakable bearing of private security. The German Shepherd's posture changed instantly, its body tensing, a low rumble building in its chest. "Easy," Silas murmured, placing a steadying hand on the dog's head. Preston strode toward them, his face set in grim determination. "This isn't over, Becky," he announced, stopping a few yards away, clearly mindful of the dog's earlier reaction. "In fact, it's just beginning." Dr. Reynolds stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, this has gone far enough. The auction is complete, legal and binding." Preston barely spared her a glance. "This isn't about the auction anymore, Reynolds. This is about fraud." Silas's expression remained impassive, but his hand tightened slightly on the leash. "What are you talking about, Holloway?" Preston smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "I've just been on the phone with the State Banking Commission. Seems there's no record of you withdrawing $200,000 from any financial institution in Montana. Care to explain where that cashier's check came from?" A small crowd had begun to gather, auction attendees exiting the building, curious about the confrontation unfolding in the parking lot. Eleanor Whitfield appeared in the doorway, her face tight with concern as she assessed the situation. "The check was legitimate," Silas replied evenly. "Your auction house verified it." "Preliminary verification," Preston countered, "but a thorough investigation will tell a different story, I suspect. No one goes from broke to liquid assets of $200,000 overnight, not legally anyway." The implication hung heavy in the air. Dr. Reynolds shook her head in disgust. "This is harassment, pure and simple." "No, Doctor, this is due diligence," Preston replied smoothly. "When someone makes an unusually large purchase that seems beyond their means, financial institutions have a responsibility to investigate possible money laundering or other criminal activity." One of the security men stepped forward, handing Preston a folder. "In fact," Preston continued, flipping it open with theatrical flair, "I have here records showing that Silas Beckett has been living primarily on Social Security and a small military pension for the past decade. His property taxes indicate land value of less than $50,000. His last known employment was 5 years ago as a part-time trainer at the community college." Silas's jaw tightened. The invasion of his financial privacy was deliberate and calculated, designed to humiliate him publicly. The German Shepherd sensed his tension, pressing closer to his leg. "How exactly did you access my financial records, Holloway?" Silas asked quietly. "That information is private." Preston waved his hand dismissively. "Public records, mostly. The point is, the numbers don't add up, and until they do, I'm formally challenging the sale." Eleanor Whitfield had made her way down the steps, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement as she approached. "Mr. Holloway, the auction house has accepted Mr. Beckett's payment. The sale is complete." "The sale is under suspicion," Preston countered, "and I have every right to demand a thorough investigation before surrendering a valuable animal under questionable circumstances." Eleanor's professional demeanor cracked slightly. You surrendered ownership when you put the dog up for auction and accepted the highest bid. That's how auctions work. Unless fraud is involved, Preston insisted. I'm prepared to file an injunction tonight to prevent Beckett from removing the dog from Billings until this matter is resolved. The threat hung in the air. Silas understood the strategy. Legal delays, mounting costs, pressure applied until he broke. It was how Preston had operated for years, using the legal system as a bludgeon against those who couldn't afford to fight back. There is no fraud here, Holloway, Silas said calmly. Just a legitimate purchase you regret accepting. Preston stepped closer, lowering his voice. You and I both know you don't have this kind of money, Beckett. What's your game? Who's backing you? Is it Westlake? Thornton? Which of my competitors put you up to this? Silas almost smiled at the paranoia. No game, Preston, just a simple transaction between a seller and a buyer. Simple? Preston's voice rose again. There's nothing simple about a man who lives in a cabin with no running water suddenly producing $200,000 in cash. The exaggeration was deliberate, painting Silas as some backwoods pauper. Several onlookers exchanged glances, the seeds of doubt beginning to take root. Silas sighed, his patience wearing thin. My cabin has running water, Preston, and electricity, and internet. What it doesn't have is your inflated sense of importance. A few chuckles rippled through the growing crowd. Preston's face darkened with anger. Mock all you want, but you're not leaving with that dog today. Not until we get to the bottom of where that money came from. He gestured to one of the security men. Mitchell here is a former sheriff's deputy. He'll be watching to ensure the animal remains in Billings while we sort this out legally. The implied threat was clear. Dr. Reynolds stepped between them, her voice sharp with authority. This is absurd. You're threatening to physically prevent Mr. Beckett from taking his legally purchased property and preventing a potentially fraudulent transaction from being completed, Preston corrected. No, you're being a sore loser, called a voice from the crowd. Sheriff Robert Carson, still in uniform, pushed his way forward. His weathered face was set in lines of irritation as he surveyed the scene. What's going on here, Holloway? I got 3 calls about a disturbance. Preston straightened, adjusting his tie. Sheriff Carson, good timing. We may have a case of auction fraud on our hands. The sheriff looked from Preston to Silas, recognition dawning in his eyes. Silas Beckett. Haven't seen you in Billings for years. Silas nodded respectfully. Robert. Been keeping to myself mostly. And buying expensive dogs with mystery money, Preston interjected. Sheriff, this man just produced a cashier's check for $200,000, despite having no visible means of support. I'm concerned about the possibility of what, exactly? Sheriff Carson interrupted, his tone making it clear he had little patience for Preston's insinuations. Silas Beckett is a decorated veteran and was one of the most respected dog trainers in the country. You suggesting he robbed a bank? Preston backpedaled slightly. Not necessarily, but because, unless you have actual evidence of a crime, what we have here is a private business dispute. The sheriff turned to Silas. The auction house accept your payment? Silas nodded. Full verification. Ms. Whitfield can confirm. Elena stepped forward. That's correct, Sheriff. The sale was completed according to all our standard protocols. Sheriff Carson turned back to Preston. Sounds like the transaction is complete, Mr. Holloway. If you have concerns about the payment, you can address them through civil channels, but you can't prevent this man from leaving with his property. Preston's face flushed with anger. This is bigger than you understand, Sheriff. That dog is the last purebred descendant of— I know exactly what that dog is, Sheriff Carson interrupted. My department had 3 Beckett Line Shepherds when I started as a deputy. Best police dogs this county ever saw. He looked at the German Shepherd, who had remained alert but calm throughout the confrontation. This one's got the look. Same intelligent eyes. The validation from an unexpected quarter shifted the mood of the crowd. The whispers were no longer about Silas's mysterious finances, but about the legendary Beckett bloodline and its connection to law enforcement throughout the region. Preston, sensing the change, switched tactics. "Sheriff, I'm not disputing the quality of the animal. I'm questioning the legitimacy of the purchase. $200,000 is far above market value for even an exceptional dog." "Market determines value," Sheriff Carson replied simply. "That's what auctions are for, isn't it?" Before Preston could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot, stopping near the gathered crowd. The driver's door opened, and Frank Wilson, Silas's old military buddy, stepped out. His Postal Service uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, but he moved with the same military precision Silas remembered from their service days. "Everything all right, Silas?" Frank called, making his way through the crowd. "Got your message?" Silas nodded. "Just wrapping up some details, Frank." Preston looked between the two men, suspicion darkening his features. "Who's this? Your mysterious financial backer?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "Financial backer? For what?" "Mr. Holloway seems to believe I've come into my money through questionable means," Silas explained, a hint of weariness in his voice. Understanding dawned on Frank's face, followed by an expression of genuine amusement. He turned to Preston. "You think Silas needed backing to buy a dog?" $200,000 worth of dog, Preston corrected, and yes, given his financial situation. Frank laughed outright. "You really don't know, do you?" Preston's eyes narrowed. "Know what?" Frank looked to Silas. "You haven't told them?" Silas shrugged. "Wasn't relevant until Holloway made it so." The exchange had captured everyone's attention. Even Sheriff Carson looked intrigued. Preston's patience snapped. "Told us what? What exactly am I missing here?" Silas sighed, clearly reluctant to share personal information, but seeing no alternative. "The cabin and small acreage I live on now isn't all I own, Preston. It's just where I choose to live." "What are you talking about?" Preston demanded. "The land," Frank explained, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "The original Beckett Ranch, all 2,000 acres of it. Silas never sold it. He leased it to the Nature Conservancy 15 years ago on a 99-year agreement, paid up front. The revelation landed like a thunderclap." Eleanor Whitfield's eyes widened in understanding. Dr. Reynolds smiled, pieces falling into place. Sheriff Carson nodded, as if confirming something he'd suspected. Preston stared in disbelief. That's impossible." "The deed transferred to Holloway Kennels when I acquired the business." "You acquired the business assets, the breeding stock, and the name," Silas corrected quietly, "not the land. Check your paperwork, Preston. Your lawyers weren't as thorough as they claimed to be." "And a 2,000-acre conservation lease outside Missoula," Frank added. "That's worth a hell of a lot more than $200,000. Preston's face had gone pale. "You're lying. This is a bluff." "Call the county assessor's office," Sheriff Carson suggested mildly. "Public record." For the first time since the confrontation began, Preston seemed genuinely shaken. His eyes darted between Silas, Frank, and the German shepherd, recalculating, reassessing. "Even if that's true," he finally said, rallying, "it doesn't change the fact that I own the rights to the Beckett bloodline. That dog may be yours now, but you can't breed from it. You can't restart what you lost." Silas met his gaze steadily. "I didn't come here to restart a breeding program, Preston. I came for this dog, nothing more, nothing less." But there was something in Silas's calm certainty that clearly unnerved Preston. He turned to Jonathan Mercer, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. "Get Lawson on the phone. I want every document related to the Beckett acquisition pulled for review, tonight." The crowd had begun to disperse, the entertainment value of the confrontation waning now that physical conflict seemed unlikely. Sheriff Carson stepped closer to Silas. "You need an escort home, Silas. Happy to follow you back to Missoula. Make sure there's no trouble on the road." Silas considered the offer, then nodded. "Might not be a bad idea, Robert. Appreciate it." Preston, listening to this exchange, made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "This isn't over, Beckett. Not by a long shot. That dog may be yours for now, but I'll be looking into every aspect of this transaction. And when I find the irregularity, and I will find it, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Silas regarded him steadily. "I think everyone here already knows what kind of men we both are, Preston. That's what's really bothering you." The simple truth of the statement hung in the air between them. Several onlookers nodded in agreement. Dr. Reynolds didn't bother to hide her smile. Preston, recognizing defeat, at least for the moment, turned abruptly and strode back toward the auction house, his security detail following close behind. Jonathan Mercer lingered briefly, an unreadable expression on his face, before he too turned away. Eleanor Whitfield approached Silas, extending her hand. "Mr. Beckett, on behalf of the auction house, I want to apologize for this unfortunate situation." Silas shook her hand firmly. "Not your doing, Miss Whitfield. You conducted yourself professionally throughout. Still," she continued, "I want you to know that all the appropriate ownership papers will be filed with the AKC immediately. There will be no administrative delays from our end." Silas nodded his thanks. As the crowd continued to disperse, he knelt beside the German shepherd, examining it more closely now that the immediate tension had passed. Despite its underweight condition, the dog's eyes were alert and intelligent, its posture balanced and ready. This was indeed a Beckett dog, through and through. "What will you call him?" Dr. Reynolds asked, crouching down to observe them both. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hand gently stroking the dog's ear. "Duke," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "His name is Duke." Dr. Reynolds nodded, understanding in her eyes. "After your son?" "After both of 'em," Silas replied quietly. "My boy and his dog. They both deserve to come home." The German shepherd, Duke, pressed his head against Silas's hand, as if affirming the choice. For the first time since entering the auction house, Silas Beckett smiled, a small private expression that nevertheless transformed his weathered face. Frank stepped closer, resting a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "Ready to head home, Silas?" Silas rose slowly, his knees protesting after the long, tense day. "More than ready." As they walked toward Silas's truck, Sheriff Carson fell into step beside them. "You know Holloway's not going to let this go, right? He's got too much pride wrapped up in it now." Silas nodded, his expression growing serious again. "I know, but for tonight at least, we've won what matters." He glanced down at Duke, walking steadily beside him. "The rest we'll face tomorrow." What none of them noticed was Jonathan Mercer, standing in the shadows near the auction house entrance, watching their departure with calculating eyes. Unlike Preston's blind rage, Mercer's gaze held something colder, more deliberate. As Silas's truck pulled away, followed by Frank's SUV and Sheriff Carson's patrol car, Mercer pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "It's me," he said quietly. "We need to talk about Beckett." "No, not Preston's tantrum. I'm talking about the old man. There's more going on here than we thought. Much more." The real battle, it seemed, was only just beginning. The drive back to Missoula was long and quiet. Sheriff Carson followed Silas's truck for the first 50 miles before turning back at the county line, with a promise to check in the next day. Frank had insisted on following all the way home, his headlights a steady presence in Silas's rearview mirror. In the passenger seat, Duke sat alert, his amber eyes constantly moving between the windshield and Silas's face. Despite his emaciated state, the German shepherd's posture remained dignified, his bearing unmistakably that of a working dog rather than a pet. Only the occasional tremor in his muscles betrayed his physical weakness. "Almost there, boy," Silas murmured as they turned off the main highway onto the gravel road that led to his cabin. "Just a few more miles." The Montana night had fully descended, stars scattered like buckshot across the vast black canvas above. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating pine trees and underbrush on either side of the narrow road. In the distance, the silhouette of the Bitterroot Mountains loomed against the night sky, a darker black against the darkness. When they finally pulled up to the cabin, Silas sat for a moment, engine idling, taking in the sight of his home. It wasn't much, a 2-bedroom log structure with a covered porch and a storage shed nearby, but it was his, chosen deliberately for its simplicity, its distance from the outside world. Frank parked beside him and approached as Silas was helping Duke out of the truck. "Need a hand getting him settled?" Frank asked, concern evident in his voice. Silas shook his head. "We'll manage. Thanks for the escort home." Frank hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave. "You sure you're okay, Silas? That was one hell of a scene back there." "Nothing I haven't handled before," Silas replied, his voice steady. "Get on home to Martha. Tell her thanks for understanding." Frank nodded, clasping Silas's shoulder briefly before returning to his SUV. As his taillights disappeared down the gravel road, Silas finally turned toward the cabin, Duke at his side. Inside, the cabin was neat but sparse, a testament to its owner's military background and simple needs. A worn leather armchair faced a small fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on dog training, military history, and animal behavior. A wooden table with 2 chairs sat beneath the kitchen window, while a narrow hallway led to the bedrooms and bathroom. Silas moved through the space with practiced efficiency, turning on lights, filling a bowl with fresh water for Duke, and retrieving some leftover chicken from the refrigerator. The dog accepted the offering gratefully but with restraint, his manners impeccable despite his obvious hunger. "We'll get you on a proper feeding schedule tomorrow," Silas told him. "Build you back up slow and steady." With Duke fed and the cabin secured for the night, Silas sank into his armchair, the events of the day finally catching up with him. His body ached with a bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Duke patted over and settled at his feet, resting his head on Silas. For a long while they sat in silence, man and dog, connected by something deeper than ownership, something rooted in shared bloodlines and history. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pines, the only sound for miles. Finally, Silas rose, his movements stiff, and crossed to a small cabinet beside the fireplace. He unlocked it and removed a worn wooden box, the finish smooth from years of handling. Carrying it back to his chair, he opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a collection of mementos: a folded American flag, a Purple Heart, several military patches, and a stack of photographs secured with a rubber band. Duke watched with interest as Silas gently removed the photos and began to look through them. The first showed a younger Silas in desert camouflage standing beside a powerful German shepherd, both squinting against bright sunlight. The next featured a young man in his 20s with Silas's jawline and eyes, kneeling beside another shepherd, this one nearly identical to Duke. Silas's hand trembled slightly as he lingered on this photograph. "That's your namesake, boy," he said softly to Duke. "My son and his dog. Best team in their unit." Duke's ears perked forward at the sound of his name, his eyes fixed on Silas's face. "Been almost 15 years now," Silas continued, his voice growing rough. "Extraction mission went bad. Intel was faulty. They walked into an ambush." The memories he'd held at bay all day now flooded back with merciless clarity. The official notification, the flag-draped coffin, the military funeral with its rifle salute and solemn-faced honor guard. The dog had been lost in the same attack, his body never recovered. 2 warriors, man and animal, bound together in life and in death. "Should have been me over there," Silas whispered, a confession made to the silent room and the attentive dog. "I was the one with experience, the one who'd seen combat before." But Duke Jr. wanted to serve, just like his old man. A tear slipped down his weathered cheek, falling onto the photograph. Duke whined softly, pressing his muzzle against Silas's hand. "When they were gone, I lost my way for a while," Silas admitted. "Let things fall apart. That's when Preston made his move. I wasn't present, wasn't fighting. By the time I pulled myself together, he'd taken everything I'd built." He looked down at Duke. "Almost everything." The German shepherd's amber eyes seemed to hold understanding beyond animal comprehension, a steady presence in the face of Silas's grief. "Your grandsire was my son's dog," Silas explained, showing Duke the photograph. "Rex, finest shepherd I ever trained, same bloodline as you, same markings, same intelligence in the eyes." Duke sniffed the photograph, then looked back at Silas, head tilted slightly. "After I lost them both, I couldn't bear to keep breeding, couldn't bear to train new dogs, knowing they'd go into danger, maybe save some lives, maybe lose their own." Silas's voice cracked. "So I stepped back, and Preston stepped in." He returned the photographs to the box, his movements careful, reverent. Preston never understood what made the bloodline special, thought it was just genetics, just physical traits that could be recorded in a ledger and reproduced by formula. But it was never just that. Silas closed the box and returned it to the cabinet, locking it with a small key he kept on his key ring. When he turned back, his face was wet with silent tears. "It was hard," he said simply. "Every Beckett dog had heart. Courage, loyalty, things you can't measure, can't document, can't replicate with scientific breeding programs." Duke rose and padded to Silas's side, pressing against his leg. The contact seemed to anchor the old man, bringing him back from the depths of his memories. "Preston thinks this was about money," Silas said, resting his hand on Duke's head. "Or pride, or revenge. He never understood that it was about honor, about making something right that's been wrong for far too long." Moving to the window, Silas gazed out at the moonlit landscape surrounding his cabin. In the distance, barely visible, stood a small wooden cross, marking the memorial garden he'd created for his son, a place he visited daily, a ritual of remembrance and connection. "Tomorrow we'll go see him," Silas told Duke. "He would have liked you, would have seen what I see, that you're more than just a dog with papers. You're the last of something special." The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. This dog represented not just a bloodline, but a legacy, a connection to his son, to his life's work, to everything he had built and lost. And Preston Holloway had nearly destroyed it through neglect and greed. "I should have fought harder," Silas whispered, the admission painful even in the privacy of his cabin. "Should have seen what Preston was doing before it was too late. Should have protected what my father and his father before him had built." The regret was a physical pain, a tightness in his chest that made it hard to breathe. For 15 years he had carried the double burden of his son's death and the loss of his life's work. Only his military discipline and stubborn nature had kept him going, one foot in front of the other, day after day. Duke whined again, more insistently this time, nudging Silas's hand with his nose. The contact pulled Silas back from the brink of his darker thoughts. "You're right," he acknowledged, wiping his face with a weathered hand. "No use dwelling on what's past. We've got work to do, you and me." Moving to the small kitchen, Silas filled a glass with water and drank deeply, then refilled Duke's bowl. As the dog drank, Silas watched him with critical eyes, mentally cataloging the care he would need, proper nutrition, gradual exercise, veterinary attention, and above all, stability and consistency. "First light tomorrow, we start fresh," Silas decided aloud. "Get you to Dr. Reynolds for a full workup, begin your rehabilitation, and then—" He paused, his expression hardening slightly. "Then we deal with Preston Holloway once and for all." Duke looked up from his water bowl, meeting Silas's gaze with steady confidence. In that moment a silent pact formed between them, a promise of loyalty, of purpose, of shared mission. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But as Silas prepared for bed that night, laying out a blanket beside his bed for Duke, he couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events had set something in motion, something beyond his control, with consequences he couldn't yet foresee. "Old day at a time," he reminded himself as he turned out the light. "Just like always." In the darkness, Duke's breathing provided a steady, comforting rhythm. The last of the Beckett bloodline had come home. For tonight, at least, that would have to be enough. The morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of autumn day that painted the Montana landscape in gold and amber. Silas woke at his usual time, just before sunrise, his body conditioned by decades of military discipline. For a moment he lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another breathing presence in his cabin. Then memory returned. The auction, Preston, Duke. He turned his head to find the German shepherd already awake, watching him with intelligent eyes. Despite having known the dog for less than a day, there was something familiar in that gaze, an echo of every Beckett dog that had come before. "Morning, Duke," Silas said, his voice rough with sleep. "Ready to begin?" The dog responded with a subtle shift in posture, alert and ready, a working dog waiting for direction. After a simple breakfast for them both, Silas loaded Duke into his truck and headed toward Missoula. Dr. Reynolds' clinic was on the outskirts of town, a modern facility that specialized in working dogs and service animals. The waiting room was empty when they arrived, the clinic not officially open for another hour. Catherine Reynolds herself greeted them at the door, her expression warming at the sight of Duke. "You came early. Good thinking." "Figured we'd avoid any complications," Silas replied, helping Duke down from the truck. Inside, Dr. Reynolds conducted a thorough examination, her movements gentle but precise. Duke submitted to the inspection with dignified patience, only his eyes tracking Silas to ensure his new handler remained nearby. "He's about 20 pounds underweight," Dr. Reynolds confirmed, making notes on her tablet. "Shows signs of stress-induced muscle tension, particularly in the shoulders and hips. Coat quality is poor, nutrition has been inadequate, but there's no evidence of disease or chronic health issues." She looked up at Silas. "The underlying dog is exceptional. With proper care, he'll recover completely." "How long?" Silas asked, his hand resting on Duke's head. 2 months for physical restoration. The psychological recovery depends on you." She hesitated, then added, "He shows signs of kennel isolation, minimal socialization, limited enrichment, common in industrial breeding operations." The clinical description of Duke's neglect tightened something in Silas's chest. "Preston knows better. He was taught better." "Knowing and caring are different things," Dr. Reynolds observed, preparing a series of vaccines. "From what I've seen of Holloway Kennel's animals, it shows their focus is quantity over quality. High volume, fast turnover." As she administered the vaccines, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowning. "Excuse me for a moment." When she returned a few minutes later, her expression had changed. "Silas, have you checked the news this morning?" "Been a bit preoccupied," he replied, nodding toward Duke. She handed him her tablet, open to the local news site. The headline made his breath catch. "Holloway Kennels under investigation. State Agriculture Department raids breeding facility." The accompanying photo showed officials in windbreakers leading dogs from a large compound. Silas quickly scanned the article. In a pre-dawn operation, state agriculture officials, accompanied by animal welfare experts, executed a search warrant at Holloway Kennel's main breeding facility. Sources indicate the raid follows months of anonymous complaints regarding animal treatment and breeding practices. Over 60 dogs were removed from the premises for evaluation. Owner Preston Holloway could not be reached for comment. Silas looked up, meeting Dr. Reynolds' gaze. "This isn't a coincidence." "No," she agreed. "The timing is too perfect. Someone triggered this investigation deliberately." "Any idea who?" Well, Reynolds took back the tablet. "The article mentions anonymous complaints going back months, but the warrant execution happening the morning after your confrontation, that suggests someone with influence made a call." Before Silas could respond, the clinic door opened and Sheriff Robert Carson walked in, still in uniform. His expression was grim but satisfied. "Thought I might find you here," he said to Silas. "Figured you'd want to know what's happening." "The raid on Holloway's facility?" Carson nodded. "Been in the works for months. State investigators have been building a case quietly. Waited until they had enough for multiple charges: animal cruelty, fraudulent registration papers, tax evasion." "Tax evasion," Dr. Reynolds repeated. "Turns out Holloway's been running 2 sets of books. One for the legitimate operation, one for the puppies sold under the table to less reputable buyers." Carson's distaste was evident. "Fighting rings, among others." Silas's hand tightened on Duke's fur. The thought of Beckett dogs bred for service, for protection, for partnership, being funneled into fighting was physically sickening. "How long has this been going on?" he asked quietly. "Years, according to the investigation." Carson hesitated. "There's more, Silas. They found documents in Holloway's office, records dating back to when he acquired your operation. The paperwork, it wasn't just shady, it was forged." Silas went very still. "What are you saying, Robert?" "The signatures on some of the transfer documents don't match your known signatures. The state's bringing in forensic document examiners, but it looks like Holloway falsified your authorization on key transfers. Essentially stole the business out from under you while you were grieving." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Silas had always known Preston's acquisition had been underhanded, had taken advantage of his distraction and grief, but outright fraud? That was another level entirely. Dr. Reynolds looked shocked. "That's why you never fought it in court." "You didn't know." "I knew something wasn't right," Silas said slowly, "but by the time I was thinking clearly again, it seemed too late. All the paperwork was filed, the business was operating under his name, my word against his documents." Sheriff Carson nodded grimly. "That's how these types operate. Create a new reality on paper, then dare you to challenge it when you're at your weakest." Duke pressed against Silas's leg, sensing his handler's distress. The contact grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of anger that threatened to consume him. "There's one more thing you should know," Carson continued, his voice lowering. "Mercer rolled on Holloway this morning. Turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity." "Jonathan Mercer?" Dr. Reynolds asked. "His business partner?" "Former partner," Carson corrected. "According to Mercer, he discovered the extent of Holloway's illegal activities about 6 months ago and has been quietly gathering evidence since. He was the anonymous source for the state investigation." Silas absorbed this information slowly. Why would Mercer turn? He's been with Preston for years. "Money," Carson said simply. "Holloway's operation is underwater financially, has been for at least a year. Those fancy auctions, the expensive facility, the show circuit, it was all for show. Behind the scenes, they've been cutting every corner possible just to stay afloat." Dr. Reynolds looked stunned. "But the prices their dogs command." "Go mostly to servicing debt," Carson explained. "Holloway leveraged everything on expansion 5 years ago, right when the market for high-end dogs softened. Been playing catch-up ever since, using increasingly desperate measures. Which explains the condition of the dogs, Dr. Reynolds realized, glancing at Duke. Minimal care, overcrowded facilities, rushing females through too many breeding cycles. Silas's jaw tightened. The abuse of his bloodline, dogs bred for generations to be partners, protectors, workers, was a desecration of everything he had built. "Where's Preston now?" he asked. "In custody," Carson replied. "State police picked him up at his house an hour ago. Multiple charges, state and federal. He won't be running dog auctions any time soon." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the magnitude of the revelation settling over them. For Silas, the news brought a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also a deep sadness for the dogs who had suffered, and anger at the years lost to Preston's fraud. "What happens to the dogs?" Silas finally asked. "State's bringing in rescue organizations to evaluate and place them," Carson said. "Most will be rehabilitated and adopted out. The breeding stock—" He hesitated, looking at Duke. "That's more complicated. There are questions about lineage, registration, ownership." Reynolds tapped her tablet thoughtfully. "The AKC will likely suspend all Holloway Kennels registrations pending investigation, which means the Beckett bloodline is effectively in limbo," Silas finished for her, "without clear ownership or valid papers." "For now," Carson agreed, "but with the fraud evidence coming to light, there's a path to rectification, legal challenges to restore rightful ownership." The possibility hung in the air, the chance to reclaim not just his reputation, but the legacy his family had built over generations. Silas looked down at Duke, the living embodiment of that legacy, now returned to his care through a twist of fate none of them could have foreseen. "There's one more thing you should know," Carson said, his voice gentler now. "When they searched Holloway's office, they found a safe. Inside was a collection of items he had no business possessing. Among them was a set of dog tags." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small evidence bag. "Military issue. They belonged to your son." Silas's hand trembled slightly as he accepted the bag. Inside were the stainless steel tags, still on their chain, the embossed information clearly visible. Beckett, Duke A.S. "How did Preston get these?" Silas asked, his voice barely audible. "We don't know yet," Carson admitted, "but Mercer claims Holloway had an obsession with controlling every aspect of the Beckett legacy. Collecting trophies, I guess you could call them." The revelation of this final violation, Preston possessing his dead son's dog tags, should have filled Silas with rage. Instead, he felt an odd sense of clarity, as if the last piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. "He never understood," Silas said quietly. "All these years, all his schemes and manipulations, and Preston never understood what the Beckett name really meant." Dr. Reynolds placed a gentle hand on his arm. "And what does it mean, Silas?" He looked from the dog tags to Duke, then back to the veterinarian and sheriff. "It means doing what's right, even when it's hard. It means loyalty that doesn't break, even under pressure. It means service without expectation of reward." He tucked the evidence bag carefully into his shirt pocket close to his heart. Everything Preston Holloway could never comprehend. As if understanding the gravity of the moment, Duke sat tall beside him, alert and dignified despite his weakened condition. In that moment, man and dog presented a united front, the past and future of the Beckett legacy, reunited against all odds. "So what happens now?" Dr. Reynolds asked. Silas squared his shoulders, decision made. "Now we rebuild. One dog at a time." 6 months had passed since the auction that changed everything. The Montana winter had come and gone, harsh and beautiful in its extremes, giving way to a spring that painted the countryside in vibrant greens and wildflower colors. On the 5 acres surrounding Silas Beckett's cabin, new life had taken root, not just in the natural world, but in the purpose that now animated the property. Where once there had been only a small cabin and storage shed, now stood a modest training facility, a fenced training yard, a small barn converted into climate-controlled kennels, and a simple office from which Silas conducted his renewed business. The sign at the entrance was hand-carved wood, understated yet dignified. Beckett Canine Training, Service, Integrity, Duke, no longer the emaciated, stressed animal from the auction, had transformed. His coat gleamed with health, muscle had replaced his former gauntness, and his eyes shone with the confident alertness that had made the Beckett bloodline legendary. He moved like a shadow at Silas's side, a constant companion and partner in the work of rebuilding. On this particular morning, Silas stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching as Frank Wilson's SUV pulled up the gravel driveway. Frank wasn't alone. Beside him in the passenger seat sat a teenage boy, perhaps 16, his expression a mixture of sullenness and barely concealed curiosity. "Morning, Silas," Frank called as he stepped out of the vehicle. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced." "Door's always open to you," Silas replied, setting down his coffee. Duke remained at his side, assessing the visitors with intelligent eyes. Frank guided the teenager forward. "This is Tyler Jackson. Judge Carson suggested he might benefit from your program." Silas studied the boy, thin with the lanky awkwardness of adolescence, but with watchful eyes that suggested a sharp mind behind the defensive posture. He recognized the look, had seen it in countless young recruits during his military days. Potential waiting to be channeled. "Sheriff mentioned you might be coming by," Silas acknowledged, extending his hand. "Welcome to Beckett Canine, Tyler." The boy hesitated before accepting the handshake, his grip tentative. "I'm not really into dogs," he mumbled, though his eyes kept darting to Duke with undisguised interest. "That's all right," Silas replied evenly. "The dogs are into you. They're good judges of character." He gestured toward the training yard. "Why don't you and Frank come see what we're doing here?" As they walked the property, Silas explained the program he had established over the past months, a combination of dog training and youth mentorship, focusing particularly on troubled teens referred through the juvenile court system. The youngsters learned discipline, responsibility, and empathy by working with the dogs, while the animals received the consistent handling and attention they needed. "We've had 6 kids complete the 12-week program so far," Silas explained. 5 of them have stayed on as volunteer assistants. 2 are working toward certification as junior handlers. In the small kennel facility, 4 German Shepherds occupied spacious runs, all rescues from the Holloway Kennels raid, all bearing the distinctive characteristics of the Beckett bloodline. In a separate, quieter section, a female shepherd rested in a comfortable whelping box, 5 puppies nestled against her side. Tyler's sullenness faded as he took in the scene. "Are those all police dogs?" he asked, his first voluntary words since arriving. "Not yet," Silas replied. "These dogs are in rehabilitation. Once they're ready, they'll be assessed for service work, police, search and rescue, therapy, or assistance, depending on their individual temperaments." "And the puppies?" "The future," Silas said simply. "The proper continuation of a bloodline that nearly disappeared." As Frank engaged Tyler with the puppies under the watchful eye of their mother, Silas stepped outside to find an unexpected visitor waiting by his truck. Dr. Catherine Reynolds leaned against the vehicle, a folder tucked under her arm, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the changes to the property. "You've been busy," she observed as Silas approached. "Nothing builds faster than purpose," he replied. "What brings you out this way, Doctor?" She handed him the folder. "DNA test results confirmed what we suspected. All the Shepherds rescued from Holloway's facility are descended from your original bloodline, though with some outcrossing that wasn't documented." Silas nodded, unsurprised. Preston was cutting corners everywhere. Proper breeding record-keeping would have been one of the first things to go. "The AKC has agreed to work with you on reconstructing the pedigrees," Dr. Reynolds continued. "With the DNA evidence and your historical records, they are willing to establish a foundation registry for the rebuilt Beckett line." It was a significant victory, official recognition that would help restore what Preston had nearly destroyed. Yet Silas received the news with quiet gratitude rather than triumph. The past months had reinforced what he had always known. Papers and pedigrees mattered, but the true worth of a dog lay in its character, its heart, its willingness to serve. "I appreciate your help with this, Catherine," he said, tucking the folder under his arm. "Couldn't have navigated the bureaucracy without you." She smiled, a hint of warmth beyond professional courtesy. Over the months of working together to rehabilitate the rescued dogs, their relationship had evolved from colleagues to friends, with a potential for something more neither had yet acknowledged. "I ran into Sheriff Carson in town yesterday," she said as they walked back toward the kennels. "Preston Holloway's plea deal was finalized. 5 years federal time for the tax evasion and fraud, plus state charges for animal cruelty. He'll never work with animals again." Silas absorbed this information without comment. Preston's downfall had been swift and complete. His reputation destroyed, his assets seized, his name now synonymous with the worst practices in dog breeding. Yet Silas took no pleasure in the man's destruction. Justice had been served, but the cost had been paid by innocent animals who had suffered under Preston's care. "And Mercer?" Silas asked. "Immunity in exchange for testimony. He's moved to Oregon, apparently, starting fresh." As they reached the kennels, they found Tyler kneeling beside Duke, who had unexpectedly approached the boy and now sat patiently as the teenager tentatively stroked his coat. Frank stood back, watching with surprised approval. "He doesn't usually take to strangers," Silas observed quietly. "Dogs know," Frank replied. "They can sense who needs them most." The simple truth of this statement resonated deeply with Silas. Throughout his life, through war and peace, triumph and tragedy, dogs had been his constant, their loyalty unwavering, their judgment unclouded by human prejudice or pretense. It was why he had devoted his life to developing a bloodline that exemplified these qualities, and why the betrayal by Preston had cut so deeply. "I was thinking," Dr. Reynolds said, watching Tyler and Duke. "The county's service dog program is looking to expand. They've got funding for 2 new canine units, but no trainer on contract. Sheriff Carson mentioned you might be interested." Silas considered this. The county contract would provide stable funding for his fledgling program and create a pipeline for placing his rehabilitated dogs in meaningful service roles. More importantly, it would reestablish the connection between Beckett dogs and public service that had been the foundation of his family's legacy. "I'll talk to Robert about it," he agreed. "Seems fitting." As the morning progressed into afternoon, more visitors arrived. Sheriff Carson to check on Tyler's placement, 2 volunteers who helped with the kennel maintenance, and one of the program graduates who now worked part-time as Silas's assistant. The once quiet property had become a hub of purposeful activity, centered around the dogs but expanding to include the humans who benefited from their presence. Late in the day, as the visitors departed and the property settled into evening quietude, Silas walked with Duke to the small memorial garden at the edge of his property. The wooden cross marking his son's memorial had been joined by a proper stone marker, engraved with both his son's name and that of his dog Rex. Fresh wildflowers gathered by Tyler during his orientation brightened the simple monument. Silas knelt beside the marker, Duke settling at his side. From his pocket he withdrew his son's dog tags, now cleaned and secured on a new chain. He had carried them daily since their return, a tangible connection to the son he had lost. "We did it, Duke," he said quietly to the stone. "We got it back. Not the business, not the money, those were never what mattered. We got back the purpose, the meaning behind the Beckett name." Duke shifted closer, pressing against Silas's leg in silent support. "Your line continues," Silas continued, his weathered hand resting on Duke's head. "These dogs will serve and protect, just like you did, just like Rex did. The Beckett legacy is secure." As the setting sun painted the Montana landscape in hues of gold and amber, Silas rose to his feet, tucking the dog tags back into his pocket. The grief would never fully disappear. The loss of his son had carved a permanent hollow in his heart, but it had been joined by new purpose, new connections, new hope for the future. Walking back toward the cabin, Duke at his side, Silas surveyed the property that had transformed from a place of solitary retreat into a center of healing and renewal. Young Tyler stood on the porch, awkwardly but earnestly helping to prepare the evening meal under Frank's guidance. Dr. Reynolds's truck was still parked in the drive, suggesting she had accepted the dinner invitation Silas had extended earlier. This was not the life Silas had envisioned for his later years. It was better, richer, more meaningful, more connected than the isolation he had constructed around himself during his years of grief. "Come on, boy," he said to Duke as they approached the cabin, warm light spilling from its windows. "Let's go home." Duke trotted forward eagerly, leading the way toward the light, the voices, the community that had formed around one man's determination to restore what had been lost. In the distance, the puppies could be heard, their small voices a promise of continuity, of legacy preserved against all odds. For Silas Beckett, kicked out of an auction for his appearance, but ultimately victorious through character and perseverance, the circle was complete. What had been broken was mending. What had been lost was found. And the future, like the Montana spring surrounding them, was full of renewed life and possibility. When life has weathered you like an old barn, still standing but bearing the marks of every storm, remember that your value isn't diminished by others' perceptions. Like Silas Beckett, you may walk into rooms where people see only your exterior, missing the wealth of experience, wisdom, and purpose that defines you. The world is quick to judge by appearance, by status, by the shine of new things rather than the reliability of the tested and true. But your worth isn't measured by others' yardsticks. It's found in your integrity, in the legacy you've built, in the lives you've touched. Even when pieces of that legacy are stolen or lost, what matters most, your character, your knowledge, your heart, can never truly be taken away. As you face your own options, moments where you must stand your ground despite dismissal, remember that dignity doesn't require explanation. And sometimes, when you stay true to your principles, life offers unexpected second chances, opportunities to rebuild what was lost, to pass on what you've learned, and to find family not just in blood, but in shared purpose. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.